On the way into filming today, I was listening to CBC Radio, and they were talking about Nexus, this cult that has impacted so many people's lives in an adverse way. And they were interviewing two of the people who participated in that cult and just the devastation in their lives. And it just struck me again how important it is for us as people who are thinking about leadership, as people who are becoming leaders, to really understand the impact of power, and leadership and power. Leaders have a tremendous capacity to influence people's beliefs, values, attitudes, and actions. And so we need to be very aware of this idea of power and influence as leaders. And so I think it's really good for us to finish off our thinking about leadership, our 10 weeks together as we've been working through what it means to be a leader and the different styles of leaders, different approaches to leadership, that we end off with this idea of power and influence. As you become a leader, as you graduate from Ontario Technical University and you move out into the world and you become a leader in your specific area of career and function, that you're always aware of this very big concern that leaders have about how their leadership exerts power on the people that they're leading, and how aware are we of that. And leaders who are self-aware and aware of power generally tend to function really well and not abuse that power. Awareness is half of the key, half of the battle. So we want to talk about how do we use power in politics to help accomplish important organizational goals. I had some students debate power, and they began, as they worked through that debate, is power good, is power bad, they began to realize power is neutral. I'm sure you've heard the statement that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. In actual fact, the research undermines that, because power doesn't corrupt. Power is neutral. It's what the people who come into power, what they were like before they came to power. Corrupt people will use power for their corrupt ends. But I think of Nelson Mandela, I think of Mahatma Gandhi, I think of many great leaders who had tremendous power, in a sense, absolute power in some ways, and yet that power did not corrupt them because of the kinds of people they were when they moved into those positions of power. And so we need to realize that power does not corrupt, and so we can use power, and we can use power for good. You think about presidents who use power to improve their countries, to improve the world. That's a good use of power. But we tend to only see the dark side of power in our world today. We want to think about this idea of charismatic leadership and practicing aspects of charismatic leadership by pursuing a vision or an idea that you care deeply about. And if I could say this, one of the things that we really need to think about today is passion. People follow leaders who are passionate. People follow leaders who have a great vision. You think of that great statement by Martin Luther King, "I have a dream." That was actually extemporaneous. It was impromptu. It wasn't actually even in his notes. But as he was speaking, he got so carried away in the moment and in the passion that he said, "I have a dream." And of course, that has stuck with us so powerfully. And he was a charismatic leader par excellence. And then we want to help you apply the concepts that distinguish transformational from transactional leadership. And in transformational leadership, we'll look at the 4 I's: idealized influence, inspirational motivation, intellectual stimulation, and individualized consideration. And so we'll look at each of those. And I want you to know that within transformational leadership, when you think of transactional leadership, we can get up to 75%. People will perform at 75% of their optimal output. But in transformational leadership, people function between 85 to 125% because they are passionate, not driven. We think people will work or commit to something, to a higher purpose, to the organizational purpose, because we're paying them. But actually, pay is the baseline. We need to inspire and motivate them through transformational leadership, idealized influence, inspirational motivation, intellectual stimulation, and individualized consideration. Very, very powerful constructs. And so transformational leadership is powerful. And again, we have to be very aware, because transformational leadership impacts the morality of those whom you are leading. And so you have to be very aware of that as you lead. You think of Adolf Hitler, who was a pseudo-transformational leader, and he impacted the beliefs, values, attitudes, and actions of the German people. He had tremendous power, but it wasn't good power because it was power that he used ultimately for his own aggrandizement. We also want you to think about how to use coalitional leadership to build alliances. And as a leader, you're going to need to realize more and more, it's not about competition, it's about collaboration. It's not about slicing the pie, it's about expanding the pie. It's not about distributive thinking, it's about integrative thinking. And so you want to think about, how do I build coalitions that enable me or enable us together interdependently to accomplish the goals that we need to accomplish. I had a friend who was raising multi-millions of dollars for development in South Africa after apartheid fell and President Mandela became the president. And he stood before the British government, and someone very high up in the government said to him, "Why should we give you this money?" And he said this: "We are going to do this because we must. Our country needs it. But with you, we can do it so much better." That's coalitional thinking. We're going to do it, but together we can do it better. We also sometimes have to call upon the characteristics of Machiavellian style leadership, because we're going to have to make tough decisions and have tough conversations, ultimately for the good of the organization, for the good of society, and the good of the people we're leading. But it doesn't make it easier, and sometimes we have to grit our teeth and courageously have those tough conversations or make those tough decisions, because ultimately they're going to bring about the best that we need to do. And that could be someone who's acted unethically in the organization, and now we have to address that, and that can be very difficult. Or someone's actions that are undermining the reputation of the organization, and how do we address that as leaders? And then, of course, you'll look at this week the distinction between soft and hard power, and situationally when to use soft power, when to use hard power within an organization. And ultimately, this idea of building social capital as a mechanism of leadership. We also then want you to think about structural, human resource, political, and symbolic frames of reference. Do you view the organization structurally? Do you view it from a human resource perspective? Do you view the organization as a political environment that has to be maneuvered and navigated? Or do you have a symbolic frame of reference? Do you view the organization as a complex adaptive system, a living organism? Depending on how you view the organization will determine your use of power and the way you use power within that organization. And you'll see that in your reading this week. You'll also want to learn and know how to increase power through political activity. And I used to think that politics was very, very bad, until I came upon the realization that politics literally comes from the Greek word polis, which means of the people. And politics simply means that you are of the people, that you're learning to work with this group of people in a meaningful way, leveraging strengths and weaknesses. And so sometimes we have to be political, we have to build alliances, we have to be aware of who is controlling what and how we build alliances with them to achieve our goals. And the influence of tactics, the need to appeal to a higher vision. And of course, again, this speaks to transformational leadership and inspirational motivation. This idea of appealing to a higher vision to motivate people is very powerful. Rational persuasion, friendliness, reciprocity, developing allies, and direct persuasion. And if I could just speak to this idea of rational persuasion, the World Economic Forum highlighted that in 2015, there were 10 skill sets that were needed. In 2020, critical problem solving or creative problem solving remained number one in 2015 and number one in 2020. But in 2020, what ranged at number 2, which I think was number 4 or number 6 in 2015, was this idea of critical thinking. And we need to more and more, as we move into a world of false news, of huge amounts of information, we need to have the capacity to really engender critical thinking and use rational persuasion to help people move in the direction that we believe they need to move. This idea of friendliness and building what I call social capital. depositing in the bank of social capital, so that when you have to have those tough conversations, when you have to make those tough decisions, you've got this tremendous amount of social capital that you can draw on, that people will give you the goodwill you need to accomplish what needs to be accomplished. Well, let's end off our session today by just again highlighting these different kinds. Transformational leadership, very powerful, 85 to 125% of output. Transactional leadership, at best 75% output. Charismatic leader, very powerful, a high commitment to vision, passionate. People follow a charismatic leader. Has to be very careful to balance that with power. And then the coalitional leader, who's able to build alliances to accomplish the key outcomes in the organization. So I want you to think about, which one of these are you, and which one of these would you like to be? And then as you work through the material this week, ask yourself the question, how do I become the leader that I want to be after all that I've learned? Thank you.